Hi, welcome to the Naughty Archaeologist podcast. Before we begin, as this is our series premiere, I'd like to get just a few announcements out of the way before we dive right in. My name is Lauren Kuntz, and I'm going to be your host and navigator throughout this entire ordeal. This season, we have 10 episodes on 10 shipwrecks, and eventually we're going to expand into submerged cities, but right now I'm still coordinating with some of the scientists that were working on those, field season. And this is coming out over the summer, so it's been touch and go with some folks who are in the field, but we're going to have an excellent season for you guys, and it's going to be 10 episodes, 10 weeks. We're going to release weekly on Wednesdays. And if you guys like what we're putting out, we're probably going to have a bigger season next season when I can get in touch with everybody. So come join us and listen to the stories. Today on the episode, we're going to be talking about the Clotilda shipwreck. The Clotilda is a very culturally impactful shipwreck. And so we've brought in Altevese Rosario. She's the vice president of the Clotilda Descendants Association. And she is also a descendant of a man who was enslaved and brought across the ocean. She has a ton of knowledge, a ton of experience, and she is fabulous to have on the show, so we're really excited to have her. Dr. Jim Delgado is a maritime archaeologist who's been in the industry for more than 40 years. He is a talking head that you see on National Geographic, and he is the vice president of Search, which is a commercial archaeology firm with a maritime division. And he was the lead archaeologist on the Clotilda survey. And so they surveyed the 12 Mile Island area that the Clotilda was found in, and then he also was the head archaeologist on the shipwreck itself. He is joining us today remotely, as well as Altevese. She's joining us from Philadelphia, and Jim is joining us from Orlando. We're really excited to have them on the show. I really think we're going to have a great episode for you today. And so, without further ado, let's get wet, nerds.
Alas, it's complicit. The timbers were way too big. But what really tells the story are thousands of pieces. We looked at them all. The treasure was not gold or silver, it was the people.
The story of the Clotilda begins on the night of July 6th, 1860, when William, or Bill, Foster decided to burn his very lucrative schooner, the Clotilda, to hide all evidence of a federal crime of smuggling human cargo. He brought in 110 enslaved individuals from the port of Whydah in modern-day Benin. In 1807, smuggling, or I should say shipments, not smuggling was always illegal, but the shipment of enslaved persons from any country was outlawed by the United States. The United States continued the practice of slavery, though the shipment of new persons kidnapped from other countries was outlawed. How good of them. In 1855, Timothy Meare, Bill's neighbor, friend, and business partner, which I don't know how you can be all three of those things, but here we are. And in 1855, they build a little schooner, and she's not really little, right? They build a two-masted schooner of 120.85 tons, and she has a 23-foot beam and is 86 feet long. For our international listeners, that is 7 meters in beam and 26.2 meters in length. She's a 6 foot 11-inch depth of hold, or 2.1 meters, which is quite tall for a hold. And she has a 6 foot 6-inch, or 2 meter laden draft. Now, this schooner is very atypical of Gulf-built schooners, and you'll hear Dr. Delgado talk about it a little bit more. Dr. Delgado was the lead archaeologist on the survey of Mobile Bay where they found the Clotilda in 2018. He is an expert in 19th century shipbuilding, and he's been in the industry for probably about 40 years. You may have seen him on National Geographic or Drain the Oceans talking about ships. Dr. Delgado has a storied career. He has talked about the centerboard for this schooner is what makes her very different, as well as her size. Not only is she over 100 tons, and only about 8 schooners that we have records of were over 100 tons that were built in the Gulf, the Clotilda among them, she had a centerboard, which makes her stand out a little bit more. A centerboard is basically a giant, essentially, it's what it sounds like. It's a board in the center of the keel. And what it does is it makes it able to go into deeper water. The Clotilda was built with the intent of going over open ocean in 1855. She was built by Bill Foster and Timothy Meare, both Mobile locals, but they were both transplants. Foster was from Nova Scotia and Meare was from Maine. And both of them were shipbuilders by trade. And so they came down to Mobile to take advantage of the slave economy and the cotton boom, which was significant. Well, they needed a way to transport it, so they built the Clotilda as a way to ship their cargo and goods around the Gulf. Now, normally, most coastal schooners were called coasties, and they didn't have a centerboard. They were made kind of for shallower shoals in that they sailed up and down the coastline. So they weren't going over open ocean. They were staying close to shore. They were sailing down from New England, as most schooners were built in Maine. And so they would sail down the eastern seaboard and around Florida into the Gulf of Mexico and around New Orleans and the port of Mobile. Of those ports, Mobile and New Orleans were the most economically bounteous, you could say. And those ports were the main ones that, quote-unquote, runaway slaves would be shipped to and from. Something to note about the federal statute that outlawed the shipment of enslaved individuals: you could still ship them interstate, you just couldn't ship them internationally. So when you can't send a text and you can't call someone pretty immediately, what does that mean for, a slave ship that simply shows up? Oh, well, they were just runaways. We didn't know what to do with them, so we just brought them back. We're just returning them. Oh, sir, we are so good. Well, that's kind of how they got away with it. There was not a lot of records. There was not a lot of names their names were stolen from them, these individuals who were enslaved, shipped to an unknown world where they were then put into backbreaking labor. It was not a pleasant experience in those industries. We've all heard the horror stories. We don't need to go into detail about it here. But it was bad, right? So the slave economy was at its peak, right? This is just before the breakout of the Civil War. This is 6 years before 1861. So they built the Clotilda to sail in and around the Gulf. And the Clotilda is atypical in that she was meant to sail over deeper water. And so she had a little more of a successful career than other coastal schooners, right? She could go to Cuba and some of these deeper water ports over greater distances because she had that centerboard. And she was prized because she had a super tall hold. Gee, I wonder why it was built so tall. Anyway, she was mostly shipping things like, at least what we have on record, things like cotton, lumber, sugar, coffee, plantains, beef, sugar cane, which I don't know if you noticed all of those industries, but they all have a very, very heavy foot in the slave economy, right? It's not white people who are harvesting these things. It is enslaved people. So these are the things that the Clotilda is on paper shipping back and forth between Cuba and Galveston and all of these ports in and around the Gulf and New Orleans and some of those other ones. Because there was such a high demand, obviously there was demand of cargo, then that means there's a higher demand for ships, and then that means there is a higher demand for also slaves to run those plantations and those agricultural areas. And so it's just kind of this self-feeding cycle. And smuggling was pretty normal. And among that economy in Mobile, New Orleans, there is rampant corruption, there is rampant racism. I mean, obviously, this is pre-Civil War South. But, I mean, these people have zero perception of power, zero control over any of the environment around them. Their names have been stolen. Their ability to do anything in control of their own environment is entirely gone. And so even though the smuggling of enslaved people is outlawed, 74 people are actually caught doing this. And sympathetic juries clear every single one of them of all charges. So because of this culture, it becomes very easy when other people are looking to the left to slip past them on the right. No one wants to care, and no one does care if you're smuggling individuals from Africa, or from Brazil, or from the East Indies, or from India, or anywhere. Though we can't prove that the Clotilda was, in fact, a little more involved with the smuggling of human cargo, there are trade routes that the Clotilda makes that they just don't have anything on paper. It's an unknown cargo. But even if we can't prove that that's what happened, and she was, in fact, smuggling more human cargo than we initially believed, she was at least complicit in the slave trade in that she was actively participating in the slave trade by transporting the cargoes and fruits of their labor. From Dr. Delgado's book, quote, Clotilda's known voyages included 2 trips in 1855, 11 in 1856, 12 in 1857, 4 in 1858, and 11 in 1859. That's a lot of numbers, stay with me. The records document Clotilda engaged in trade between northerly American Gulf ports in Florida, Alabama, Texas, and Louisiana, and those in the southern Gulf and Caribbean in Mexico and Cuba. The 3 most frequently visited ports were Mobile, New Orleans, and Brazos de Santiago, Texas. The rest of the ports Clotilda engaged in trade with were Apalachicola, Florida, Franklin, Louisiana, Galveston, Matagorda, and Sabine Pass, Texas, Havana and Matanzas, Cuba, and Tampico, Mexico. Clotilda's trips indicate that the schooner operated solely within the Gulf of Mexico and the Northern Caribbean trade network, spanning both the United States and international ports in Mexico and Cuba. Although the Gulf of Mexico is a semi-enclosed basin, it required vessels that could handle open ocean travel, with variable weather and sea conditions, over long distances, and in rough water like the channel between the U.S. mainland and Cuba. A lucrative trade market was already in full effect within the region as Clotilda entered the scene in 1855. The increased production of textiles in the northern states and in Great Britain created a demand for cotton, a major export of New Orleans and Mobile. Now, because of all of this, Bill Foster and Timothy Meare were making a lot of money. And of course, they had disdain for any kind of abolitionist movement or anyone who told them that they can't do what they want. And they were wealthy, and so they made a bet that they could get human cargo past what was then the Coast Guard and into Mobile. So they set to work. They made a plan, and they found a crew. They didn't tell them everything right away. They got the people they wanted, and they left Mobile Bay for the port of Whydah. Meare had been the one to propose the voyage and set forth the terms of the bet. Part of the bet was that they had to get away with it. Emma Roche, in a book in 1914, wrote, "The wager was taken and the stakes were large." Just a few short months later, they set sail. Despite also being the shipbuilder, Bill Foster was also captain of the Clotilda. Other crew included 30-year-old mate John Simonton of Portland, Maine, 27-year-old mate James Smith of Boston, and 4 crew members listed as Joseph DeFlo, James Small, William Copeland, and James Welch. But Foster later stated the crew was actually 12 people, including himself. So he didn't tell the crew exactly what they were doing, right? But they would find out. But I mean, it was Foster's whole shtick. He later says, "Promises are like pie crusts, made to be broken." So he's just a really stand-up dude. Foster dealt with a mutiny almost immediately after leaving, and then again when he returned to Mobile. Because the crew, again, was not told what they were doing, and when they found out, oh, hey, this is a smuggling mission, we want more money. And so they demanded that of Foster. Foster gave them initially $8,000, which he claims he paid them at the end of the voyage. So it sounds like he made a lot of promises that he ultimately didn't really keep. What a shock. With this crew, Foster takes them across the Atlantic into the port of Whydah, which is modern-day Benin, where he loads approximately 113 individuals onto the Clotilda. 110 would land in Mobile. Many of these individuals were captured by King Lili of the Dahomey, whose female warriors heavily inspired the Dora Milaje of Wakanda. The Dahomeys had conducted a series of raids in the inland areas, and they had captured several of the young individuals from several different tribes of that area, and they had brought them to what's called the Barracoon, which is another of my sources. Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo, by Zora and Neale Hurston. Barracoon is the Spanish word for barracks, and this is a place where these individuals were collected and placed until they were ready to be sold. And this book is about Kosala Oluwale. He survived capture at the hands of the Dahomey warriors and then was loaded onto the Clotilda after he was chosen from a handful of others that were also in the Barracoon with him. Hurston interviews him for the book. Ultimately, he would take the more easily pronounced name, a slave name, Cujo Lewis, which would be the name that would ultimately pass in generations down, though his African name was never lost. He, among others, survived the Clotilda, and they started the community of Africatown, aka Plateau, which is just north of Mobile. Later we'll be joined by Altevese Rosario. She is the vice president of the Clotilda Descendants Association, and she's going to tell the story about her affiliation with Cujo Lewis, Oluwale Kosala, and her experience growing up in Plateau and Mobile. Archaeology is about people, and we want the people who are still around to be able to tell their own stories. Altevese has joined us from Philadelphia, and will be telling her experience as a descendant of the Clotilda survivors. And now back to the Clotilda, just for a little bit longer. Once on board the ship, the kidnapped captives then endured a horrific voyage in their own excrement and sweat, naked and chained, except for a few brief moments where they were allowed on deck to stretch their legs and move their arms around a little bit. Because, you know what, the white men were going to want to use those later. So they're on deck only a couple of brief moments. They can't be seen by other ships, and so as soon as any other ship is on the horizon, they're quickly shuffled back into the hold. After 45 days of nightmare, they come to Port of the Pines, near the port of Mobile. Foster landed and hires a horse and buggy for the overland part, and then he comes back to the ship, and he has chartered the tug William G. Jones Jr., which is quite the name for a vessel, so locals have shortened it to the Billy Jones. And it's Captain James W. Hollingsworth at the helm, and he takes them back to the Clotilda, and they tow it upriver, silently. And by silently, I mean, to the noise of a steamboat. They take it up the Mobile River and through a series of forks and little streams and estuaries. It's pretty shallow waters. The centerboard has been locked up and stowed, and the Clotilda, because of the way that she's built, can traverse these waterways without getting too in the weeds, literally. Billy Jones takes her up into Mobile River and to a spot called 12 Mile Island, just off the Bayou. They offload everybody into the canebrake. It's a thicket of tall grass. They make sure that they are all accounted for, except for the dead, which it's estimated that there were one or two that were thrown overboard during the voyage. We don't know who. We don't know their ages. But at this point in the voyage, all of the enslaved individuals, scared, tired, hungry, and having the worst night of their entire lives, are shuffled off of this ship into the canebrake and the gators and the snakes and the mosquitoes, the spiders, and every bug and critter that the southeast swamps have to offer. And they're shuffled off onto another steamboat, the Zora, which takes them upriver to Dabney's plantation. In the meantime, Meara and Foster are responsible for burning all evidence. So what do? They scuttle the Clotilda in the reeds, and they light it on fire. According to Emma Roche, quote, "Lights were smothered, and in the darkness, quickly and quietly, the Clotilda's cargo was transferred to the steamboat, and then the Clotilda was scuttled and fired. Captain Foster himself placed 7 cords of light wood upon her." End quote. John Dabney, the owner of the plantation where the enslaved individuals were sent, was a friend of the Meares. And once everyone was up at his plantation, they were all divvied up like a horrific gambling winnings, because that's what they were, right? These were the winnings from a bet. They had won the bet. How great for them. And so they divvy up their spoils, and they are sent on their way. And they hide, essentially lay low, for a couple of weeks. Now, either somebody talked, or somebody started to notice that, hey, there's a whole lot of black Africans around here that don't speak a whole lot of English, which seems to be a kind of what happened. According to Delgado, it says, the Mobile Mercury noted on July 23rd, 1860, for example, that, quote, some inn who never learned to talk English went up the railroad the other day. There were 25 of them, apparently all of pure, unadulterated African stock, end quote. Because of this, it seems that there was a small search effort that went into trying to look for where these individuals had come from. Might I emphasize small? According to Delgado again, quote, the slave trading crime was quickly discovered, however, and the news of the illegal importation of captives to be enslaved spread not only to government officials, but to the entire country via newspapers. Nashville's Tennessean, 10 July 1860, page 3, reported that the schooner Clotilda with 103 Africans arrived in Mobile Bay and a steamboat took the inn up the river. The event was nationally publicized, with stories in newspapers from Maryland and Wisconsin to Alabama and North Carolina. The incident even became international news, with London's Morning Post on October 5, 1860, including an entry for Clotilda in an article on the slave trade. The news, both local anecdotes and national articles, spurred a search for Clotilda by the U.S. government. End quote. Nobody really found the Clotilda. Locally, it became a bit of an open secret. Mayor Ann Foster had burned the ship in about 20 feet of water just up from Mobile in 12 Mile Island and Bayou Canal. A nice little ship graveyard for the ship to go to its grave. No one knew exactly which ship it was, they just knew that that's the backwater where it got sunk. Not hard to figure out, right? But legal action was pursued against Timothy Meare. Not that anything really came of it, though. Foster and Dabney were also included. We gotta remember how important dates are in history. The Clotilda landed in Mobile Bay on July 6th, 1860. The investigation lasted further into October. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas, aka the outbreak of the Civil War, took place July 21st, 1861. Almost a full year and 2 weeks after landing in Mobile. In the grand scheme of the investigation and the search for the Clotilda, the Civil War broke out relatively quickly in the grand scheme of time. Alabama seceded from the Union, and only Foster was, you could put punished in quotations. He was given a $1,000 fine for failing to meet with customs officials and return his documentation from the voyage. He never paid the fine. And with that, the legal case against Bill Foster was concluded. Now, about 150 years later, give or take a couple, I don't do math well, Ben Raines, an environmental journalist with AL.com, gets inspired to find the Clotilda. He thinks he knows where it is, and he wants to find it. So he starts the search. Ultimately, he ends up in Bayou Canal and the 12 Mile Island area. He thinks he's found something. So in 2018, he publishes the story. Wreck found by reporter may be last American slave ship, archaeologists say. The story, which spread very, very quickly like wildfire, made national and international headlines. Because of the cultural implications of this shipwreck, this is the last known, emphasis known, ship that smuggled Africans out of their home country and kidnapped them and brought them to be enslaved in the United States, that we know of. From Dr. Delgado's book, quote, Raines brought to the site the maritime archaeologists Greg Cook and John Bratton from the University of West Florida in neighboring Pensacola and wooden shipwright Winthrop Turner. It was a cold day, and the team did not have dive gear or the means to get into the water to examine any portions of the wreck other than what was exposed by the low water. Raines also lacked a permit from either the Alabama Historical Commission, the AHC, which is the legal stewards of Alabama's historical and archaeological resources, or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or USACE, Mobile District, which regulates activities in and around regional waters. Cook and Bratton limited the investigation to observations that would not disturb anything. Looking at the visible remains, the two archaeologists in the shipwright determined that some of the observed features made a strong case for further exploration, including the fact, Raines noted, that the wreck lay essentially where its captain, William Foster, said he burned and sank it in 1860. A piece of evidence that did not fit, however, was that the wreckage as observed that day was about 124 feet long, or 37.8 meters. It was not the 86-foot, or 26.2 meters, recorded length of Clotilda in its official registration documents, which were filed with the U.S. government when it was built in 1855. Raines theorized that perhaps the length as historically measured was too small to have carried that crew, captives, and supplies. Doing his own research, he calculated that Clotilda's overall length could have been 40 feet, 12.2 meters, longer, and fit the dimensions of what was now before them. This was incorrect, as he misinterpreted the various means by which, quote, length, was recorded in the period. Length overall, which he drew on to offer his hypothesis, was a measurement from the tip of the bowsprit to the end of the stern, not the length of the hull. Being unfamiliar with ship construction and historical vessels, Raines also failed to note that the large timbers that formed the structure of the wreck were simply too big to be consistent with the timbers used to build Clotilda, which would have been smaller and more slight. End quote. So even though Raines was wrong initially about the 12 Mile Island wreck, which is now what his find is called, he still found something pretty significant. However, that's not what this podcast episode is about. If you would like to read more about the 12 Mile Island wreck, I recommend you pick up Dr. Delgado's book. It's very good. And despite his find, and despite being incorrect initially, the story still caught like wildfire. It spread around the world. National Geographic picked it up, and they contacted Dr. Delgado. Now, not only was Dr. Delgado contacted, but so was the Alabama Historical Commission, who immediately put together essentially a dream team of researchers who could come together, do a completed survey with the appropriate permits and permissions from the state and the Army Corps of Engineers to go and look in the survey area of the 12 Mile Island section of river that essentially was backwater. They found a ship graveyard and over 14 different targets. I'll let Dr. Delgado take it from here. Just briefly, I want to introduce who Dr. Delgado is, one of the world's leading experts in the field of maritime archaeology and cultural heritage. He is the vice president of a private archaeology firm, a commercial firm called Search. Jim has over 40 years in the maritime archaeology field, as well as a background in history, museums, and media, film, and other publications, and has over 30 books that he's published. Jim is the founder of the Maritime Heritage Program for the National Park Service and was the first historian for the Golden Gate National Recreation Area in the Bay Area, where he participated in the restoration and interpretation of Alcatraz. Additionally, Jim was the director of the Maritime Heritage Program at NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Jim is a lead on anything Clotilda related. He led that research and survey, and also a senior advisor to the Drain the Oceans series on National Geographic. So we want to thank Jim for coming on the podcast, and we're really excited that he's here with us.
Hi there.
Let's get started. Jim, can you tell us about why the schooners were so important? What's the significance of a schooner?
Schooners were the American work ship, the work boat, if you will. Not only in the 19th century, but even earlier. They're a quintessentially American craft in a lot of ways because they were more or less easy to build. They literally were the semi-trucks of the age. And with that, they could carry all sorts of cargoes, from lumber and other commodities to merchandise for markets. They're relatively easy to sail. And what also makes them perfect or ideal as a craft, particularly for coastal work, is that because they are rigged in a way so that they don't have squared masts, that is, they don't have yards that stretch across them with big sails hanging, which means you more or less got to get the wind behind you to move. These are rigged in a way, it's called a fore and aft rig, with a gaff and a boom and a sail that swings back and forth. You can tack, that is, zigzag your way along the coast get into a narrow cove, go into the mouth of a river. You have far more maneuverability with a schooner than you do with other crafts. But you also had the ability to take them out to sea and sail them on the open ocean. And with a schooner, sometimes you caught the wind more easily than you would with a full-rigged ship.
What is the significance of a centerboard on a schooner? Why does it change how and where you can take your boat?
In many cases, schooners, particularly schooners that are going to go in and out of a shallow port. Let's say you've got a sandbar at the mouth of a river, blocks getting in past that and going into a port that's up the river. Or you've got something like Mobile Bay, where it's shallow. If you have to sail a ship in those shallow waters, your hull is low, but not too low, so that you're not going to catch or hit the bottom. But once you get out into deeper water, there you need some depth. You need to have a deeper keel. You need to be setting more in the water. What a centerboarded is basically a drop keel. It's hinged in a wooden trunk. Basically, what's a trunk? It's a lined well that is watertight, and just pulling one pin out, that thing swivels down and like a big dagger hangs beneath the hull and gives it a little more stability. So with that, you can take a vessel that works in shallow waters, and suddenly by dropping a centerboard, you're out there on the open water in the deeper ocean. So it's a means by which you can have it all as a sailor.
What defines a schooner as a schooner? Is it something in the rigging? Is it something in the way that the hull is shaped? Can you talk a little bit about that?
What really defines a schooner is the rig, and that is the masts and the sails. If it's fore and aft rigged, if you've got sails that are rigged on a boom and a gaff, that is the lower big spar, and the top one that you raise by hauling on the ropes to get that up there, that's a schooner and a schooner rig. I know them well because not only have I studied them, I've sailed them, including 19th century schooners that still survive. And yeah, that also has included dropping the centerboard and then the tedious task of, with line and tackle, hauling that heavy thing back up, aided by the fact that the blocks help take some of that weight, making it a little easier.
What do you mean by blocks?
Blocks are big wooden sheaves that literally have the rope run through them. And they're incredible labor-saving devices. They really give you more lift. A double block, a triple block. The more blocks you have, the more sheaves in them, the more you can lift. So, just to give you an idea, we were sailing on the schooner Grace Bailey in the Gulf of Maine about a year ago. With that, we have this big, tall mast standing there with the sail out there. And this sail, it weighs a lot. It's heavy canvas. And that gaff and that boom, you're literally trying to raise a few thousand pounds. How do you do that when you've only got 6, 8 people and somebody's got to be steering? What should is those blocks and those lines, they take some of that weight, and through that block and tackle system, you're able to lift far more. So we just worked it. And what most people don't probably remember is that the fun part of all of this is you got to do it together. So it's not just a 1, 2, 3 pull. The best part is that's one of the reasons why they invented the sea shanty for the song. So with that, you have an opportunity to time the work. So on Grace Bailey, that one day when I was there, it's like, you can either do it, heave away, haul away, Joe, haul. Or you can, hanging Johnny. Oh, they call me hanging Johnny. Away, boys, away. And on that away, boys, away, 1 long pull, 2 long pulls. They says I hangs for money, which gives everybody a chance to rest. So hang, boys, hang. Another 2 pulls. Sea shanties were invented to time the work, to give you a spell, and also to make it pass with a little more fun. And then at the final call, avast! The order to stop, you've got it, and it's tied off, and your sail is all the way up and ready to go, or it's partially up and reefed, that is tied so that you've got a little less canvas exposed. And that's basically, the more sail that's up, the more wind it can catch. That's like putting your pedal to the metal. That's putting the foot on the gas.
I'm going to make that our theme song.
You've got some pretty amazing shanty singers out there. And with that, songs that speak not just to work shanties, but life at sea, loss, a whole range of things.
I almost used Hanging Johnny. I was trying to get my voice to sound like Seven, and I couldn't ever time it correctly. What about the Clotilda made her not like normal schooners? What was typical to see in a schooner in the Gulf, what we call coasters, and what was so specifically special about Clotilda?
Well, first off, let's just acknowledge that the most different, the thing that stands out about Clotilda is that it was used to commit this crime. And we suspect that that wasn't the only time. The local folks in Mobile said that Clotilda had been involved in more than one voyage that had illegally brought captives from Africa for the purposes of enslaving them. And while we know about the last voyage that arrived in July of 1860, there may have been others. And in going through the records, there's little hints here and there that suggest it. Bear in mind, this is a time when a number of officials ashore in the South and in the North as well are looking the other way. So that's one thing that really sets Clotilda apart. What also set Clotilda apart was that it's built on the Gulf Coast, and the Gulf Coast is defined by all these ports that are basically shallow water ports. And in particular, you go to a place, Galveston, you have to go across a bar. You have to go across those mudflats to get up and into New Orleans. And likewise, you have to come in through the pass and go up shallow Mobile Bay. Pensacola, Apalachicola, you name it. These schooners had to be pretty shallow. And if you're working in and around the coast, shallow draft is all you need. And we know how most of them were built that way because even then, you had to register with the government. You had to get a license, basically. And that certificate of enrollment gave us a sense not only of size, but of how much a ship could carry, because they measured those things, came up with a formula that said, this is the tonnage. It wasn't what it weighed. It's how much they could tax you for. So if a schooner is registered at 80 tons, that's the amount of cargo that the fair can say, okay, I'm going to tax you the rate on 80 tons of cargo. They go in and measure it and look and say, oh, he's only half full. We're going to tax him for 40 tons, but no argument. You go before a registered surveyor, and that's what's filed with the government, and it's in those documents. And unless that custom house burned, those records survive. Going through the records of all the Gulf schooners built from the beginning of the American period after the purchase, the Louisiana purchase, all the way through well past the Civil War, you see the bulk of these things, 30, 40, 80, maybe a little bigger in terms of the tons. What makes them bigger is more cargo space, which means not only longer and wider, but deeper. Now, to that end, ultimately they shift from just doing the tons to what is that length? What is that width? What is that depth? So we, in doing the work on Clotilda, went through all of those records, and I mean thousands of them. What was helpful is that everything in and out of the port of New Orleans, which is the big one, had actually been researched, put into large volumes during the Depression, typed up, and they're now online. So we still had to go through and read every line and pull out every schooner and look at all of that. Where it got tougher is in Mobile, those records weren't. And so we went to the National Archives in Atlanta and went through the original books, big, huge documents covered in dust, opening them up, and then going through and going, okay, here's a schooner, and writing it down. Like Apalachicola, all of these ports, any place where you could register and, get your certificate of enrollment, we looked at them all. Back to Clotilda. Clotilda was only one of a handful of these vessels that was built bigger. It not only was, big in terms of its size, it's, 86 feet long, and it's got that big breadth and width to it, but it's also practically twice as deep as it would have been if it was just a regular Gulf schooner. Now, it could still go in and out of Mobile Bay, but it also had a centerboard, which meant it was intended to go offshore. When it was built in 1855, the schooner was registered, and newspaper accounts talk about it being in the lumber trade, which makes some sense. They were cutting down lots of trees in Mobile, and a lot of those were being sold just across the water in Cuba. because the Cuban sugar plantations were producing a lot of product, and southern box shooks, basically the pieces of wood that make a crate, were being shipped across in large numbers to package that. That brings up another point. Clotilda is well known as the last known ship to bring people from Africa to enslave them. But it was involved in the economy of slavery from the beginning. It was built using enslaved, stolen labor. It was loaded using that labor. It was unloaded using that labor. And the products that it was loading, Cuba was full of plantations worked by enslaved people. So it's complicit in all of that, in addition to participating not only in the one, but as I said, maybe likely other voyages where captives are being brought in for the purposes of enslavement. So all of this, I think, factors into why Clotilda stands out. And it's that standing out in terms of its size and how it's built that would prove to be an important clue in trying to figure out, is this vessel, is this wreck Clotilda?
That's exactly what leads into my next question. How did you figure out exactly which wreck was the Clotilda? Because you guys identified the Clotilda essentially inside a ship's graveyard. How did that come about, and how did that contribute to the verification of the Clotilda's identity?
Well, first off, I'm glad you actually phrased it as you did, identify. Clotilda's location was never really lost. Captain Foster very specifically said that when, at the end of his voyages, he left an account, and it's somewhat in code in a way. He's not saying specifically where he went and what he did, but he sailed in, and what he does say is he came up with Clotilda being brought in by a tugboat, and he stopped at the junction of the Spanish and the Mobile rivers, and there he met the riverboat Zora, and in the cover of darkness, he transferred his captives, his human cargo, into Zora. He said, I then burnt and sank my schooner in 20 feet of water. That suggests he did it pretty close by. Now, other accounts, when talking to locals, said, no, absolutely, he did it in the Bayou, in Bayou Canal.
I've been pronouncing it right. I'm so proud of myself.
So, is that the same Bayou Canal of today? We had to look at that because there's still a whole area. There's a little Bayou Canal and big Bayou Canal, and it could have been Canal as well. Who knows? I've heard it pronounced both ways.
Me too. I tried to look it up on YouTube, and it was just
right.
Both.
No. So with that, we figured it had to be close by. There's that old, the Occam's razor. What's the simplest? I said he couldn't have gone far. He's got a vessel that's no longer rigged to sail. His crew are gone. He's discharged his human cargo, and he needs to get rid of that ship and get rid of it fast. So what we often said is we'd be sitting there in the boat going, where do you think it is? And it's like, well, if you just stole a car and robbed a bank and you're making your getaway, what are you going to do? Are you going to drive that car for a long way and take a lot of turns? Well, you're going to drive it into the next alley, set it on fire. And that's pretty much what we figured he'd done. Now, with that as well, other people had said it's somewhere in the area and close by, in and around 12 Mile Island. We did a lot of research. A lot of folks had said it was somewhere in and around 12 Mile. And to that end, a lot of surveys had been done. A local historian of note who I knew and who's now gone was Jack Friend. And Jack was fascinated with Mobile's maritime history and naval. He funded a lot of surveys and searches, and thanks to Jack Friend and thanks to the Alabama Historical Commission, a lot of surveys were funded, and they looked everywhere, except the backside of 12 Mile Island. Well, let's just say, it was pretty close. Would that be it? Interestingly enough, John Sledge, local historian, wrote a great book about the Mobile River, and he talked to one of the members of the Mayer family. He took him out on a boat, and the Mayer family were the folks who owned Clotilda and had commissioned the crime. And when they went down that section of river, one of the mayors said to John, well, we just passed the wreck. He didn't say where and exactly, but John, okay, so it's somewhere here in and around 12 Mile Island. When all this broke, that a wreck had been found at might be it. We looked at it, and it was pretty clear from the photographs that it couldn't be. The timbers were way too big, and it looked not to be a southern pine, but more dense wood. No, it was a very soft wood. It looked like Douglas fir. Wouldn't know until we went and took a wood sample. But I looked at it, looked at the size, looked at that, and I said, this looks an awful lot like wrecks that we'd looked at from World War I when they went back to building big ships of wood to offset German U-boat losses in World War I. Said, okay. So Kyle Lent started looking at things, and he said, look, the old charts show a lot of wrecks in here. And I said, that makes sense. He goes, why is that? And I said, ship graveyard. You always take a backwater, someplace like this, and that's where you park boats at the end of their life. If they don't sink, and if you can't, otherwise get rid of them, and it's not really economical to break them up, you just park them and let them be. It's the equivalent of that old back lot where everybody parks old cars when their time is counted. Said, this looks to be a ship graveyard. A lot of research later, we found it was a ship graveyard, and it started being one, at least in the 19th century. There were a couple of shipwrecks that had happened in and around it, but in particular, it became a big ship graveyard at the end of World War II, when a lot of ships left over from the war were brought there and were going to be laid up indefinitely, perhaps until called up for another national emergency, another war, in what we called mothball fleets back in those days. But the ones that were really old, the ones that had been battle damaged, there were a couple of them that had been torpedoed by the Germans and had been fixed up, but they could never really go to sea again. They decided to park them there and sell them, and a company was formed to start to cut them up with torches and pull them apart with cranes and tackle. Interestingly enough, you can find them online. They digitized them. The 3x5 cards that were the files for all those wrecks that were laid up there in that ship graveyard, you never guess where they said that was, that spot, which we have photographs of. Bayou Canal.
It seems so simple.
Well, it does, but everybody else is thinking, well, wait a minute, Bayou Canal's over there. And so we started looking at it and said, now let's go back and let's look at all the other records. So we went back, the U.S. Coast Survey actually mapped that area, and what they showed back in the 1880s was what we now see as a bend in the river wasn't. It was a swamp. It was a bayou. And the only way that they could actually map it out is they took the deepest part as they could sense it because of the current running through. They cut small trees and made stakes out of them, and then they surveyed those points to say, okay, this is the bend in the river. Otherwise, in this big flooded swamp. At that stage, too, they'd also built a few decades earlier a system to channel the river and make it flow stronger, to naturally dredge it and make it deeper. Those two things took an area that had formerly all been part of the bigger bayou and turned them into a very focused, funneled other channel around 12 Mile Island. So this back section, a 12-mile, really was in the bayou. So with that, we're like, okay, this is looking pretty good. And we also started hearing from people as we were surveying, and it was sort of the old version of getting hotter. No, cold, because there were people who knew exactly where it was. And when we ultimately found it, things had been pulled off of it. It was actually photographed in the early 20th century. And when we went back and started matching things up, yes, that's the wreck. And people back then were thinking, well, no, that can't be. But no, it was. People were saying, that's a Clotilda. So you go back to what happened in 1865. Slavery's legal. A lot of these folks there supported it. A lot of people were involved. A lot of people had been rewarded for helping pay for the voyage. So people were coming off of that ship and then being sent to these local places. A lot of folks talked about it. And the federal marshal is a slave owner. The judge in town is a slave owner. So everybody looks and finds nothing, but everybody knows where it is. So to that end, it wasn't really a question of finding Clotilda. It was a question of systematically going, looking at everything, and not just relying on the old charts that said wreck, but surveying it with equipment so that we could pick up anything never charted, and then systematically looking at everything, leave no stone unturned. It's basic CSI detective work. Just look. And when you find something that looks like it might be, work really hard, not to prove it is, but to prove it isn't. And when you can't prove it isn't and things start to line up, then you start going to a likely or probable to ultimately being able to say, and not always say, yep, that's Clotilda.
Why is pin the name on the shipwreck such a dangerous endeavor, or risk, I should say?
Folks like to play pin the name on the wreck. It's one of the oldest ones around because the idea of a name links us to history and to people. It ties you into events. So yes, finding a wreck that you could say is Clotilda, yes, there it is. And you've got something now that you can say definitively X marks the spot, and this is it, and this is the history that it represents, that you've read about in the newspaper or that you've read about in a book. But we can't always. Many of the wrecks that we find are anonymous. It doesn't make them any less significant, but it does make them a little less historically prominent unless they gain their own history through what we learn from the archaeology. And ultimately, pin the name on the wreck is a game many people like to play. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. If you do attach a name to a wreck, particularly if it's a wreck that has a history, then you've linked directly to something that a lot of people have read about, and that's powerful. But if you can't, you're left with a wreck that you can say, about this time, what was it doing, maybe this, what was it built as? Those sorts of things can come about. You can begin to ascribe perhaps the type of trade it was involved in. Well, it's full of fish bones. It was a fishing boat. But those kind of wrecks basically get archaeologists excited unless they go into the history books, because what we find in the wreck helps us rewrite history, like the Ullebrun shipwreck did, one of the oldest wrecks in the world. So pin the name on the wreck, it's overrated, but when it happens, it's powerful.
Definitely. In the Mobile River, the difficulty of getting that name was probably exacerbated in some cases by the challenges of the river itself. What were exactly some of those challenges you guys ran into in using the instruments that you were using to get profiles of like sub-bottom sonar, side scan sonar, magnetometers? Why would you use sub-bottom versus side scan? What are some of the differences in that equipment? And can you talk to the effect of that?
Absolutely. Well, first off, this is water that for the most part is at best the consistency of a really strong cup of coffee without any cream in it. And if there's cream in it, it's basically thick river mud. So you're not seeing much in it. And at best, we'd have maybe a few inches of visibility at any given time. And once you start getting deeper, it just goes dark. And so oftentimes we were doing what we've always known as archaeology by braille. So you've got that. You also have a wreck that may be largely shrouded in mud. It may be completely in mud. Being completely buried in mud was one reason why we brought a sub-bottom profiler, which uses sound waves to look through mud to see what's below. And if we came back with a strong image based on that sound bouncing through the softer mud and coming back after hitting harder wood or metal, say, well, that's ship-shaped. Or no, that's not. So that was one reason for that piece of equipment. But the side scan sonar picks up everything using sound waves to give you a very accurate, high-resolution image of what's sticking above.
Hey guys, coming at you in post. Just wanted to say we had some technical difficulties at this point, so I've reinserted where we picked up.
So when something sticks up, the sonar sees it, and it gives you an image on a computer screen. It's not a photograph. It's three-dimensional. And it may not look like a ship, but we've learned over time, yes, look at how those are spaced. Those look like teeth in a mouth. Could those be the ribs or the frames of a ship? So with that, we use those, but a magnetometer picks up changes in magnetism. It's not like a big metal detector. Something big like a ship will be filled with mud, and that will help with rocks that dampen the magnetic field in an area. Metal will enhance it. So we get all these fun readings that almost look like a topographic map with big high peaks and valleys, and that's how strong the magnetism is. And over time, having done enough of this, a good magnetometer reading archaeologists or experts can say, that's a shipwreck signature. So all three instruments used together gave us a pretty clear sense of, wow, there's multiple wrecks here. And now that's a steel barge. That's a big steel ship. That's a steamer. But here's a couple ships that appear to be wood. And that was how we narrowed it down to Clotilda, which was target 5. But that didn't mean that we didn't go and dive on and look at everything to check every box and every one. If we were in the middle of a crime scene investigation, we'd talk to every witness and we'd look at every clue in that back alley. And so here we were looking in that backwater at every clue.
Speaking of talking to the witnesses, how was it working with the families that were affected, not only the Clotilda Descendants Association, but with some of the other residents of Plateau, aka Africa Town? What was the experience like working with the Slave for X project and the individuals that were a part of that?
I think it's really important for every archaeologist to acknowledge the fact that what we're doing is we're not studying things. We're talking about people. We're studying what people have left behind. And in some cases, particularly in antiquity, we're looking at those people themselves. And you approach your work with that as the basis of your ethos. It's humbling to consider that you're looking at something which is intensely a family story for many families that has somehow and powerfully, because of a circumstance like Clotilda, become a national, if not an international story. Nobody knows it better than the families, but other people still have a sense of it. So with that, yes, we approach this from the start with open communication and sharing with them first and getting their perspective. Some folks said they thought it was in that area. Others didn't know. A few people said that at times that their ancestors had talked about going back to the site. Some people also told us that they felt powerfully that their ancestors who had passed would occasionally in the spirit world, they would come back and revisit that site of so much trauma. With that, working with our colleagues in the Slave Wrecks Project, who I've worked with in previous years on other wrecks, was, as always, a powerful exercise in not just teamwork, but with the perspectives that they brought, particularly when many of them came from families whose ancestors had also been brought forcibly on ships, but early enough that given the way records were kept and names were taken away and cultures were suppressed, they don't exactly have a touch point, such as Clotilda, to say this is where, this is how. The key thing for everybody to remember is that we took our time at every step to be thoughtful, to be thinking of those 110 people who had been taken and loaded on that ship, not all of whom made it to Mobile. Some died on the way. Some, as we're now seeing in Hannah Durkin's recent book, were children who were murdered and thrown overboard. Let's not forget what we're talking about here and what this vessel represents. So, yeah, it was a very emotional and powerful site to work on. Probably one of the most important and most emotional that I have worked on. And I've worked on wrecks of great significance and some with great loss of life. But it's different than diving and working on Titanic. It's different than looking at ships from World War II or other wars. So yes, there it was. But the power of this as well is that for the families, being able to take some out and more people seeing it. And now with Descendants actually taking boats out and showing people this is where it is. That's incredible. And with that, Clotilda being identified and being preserved can stand not just as the last, but as a very well-preserved bit of forensic evidence, as a powerful touchstone, as a monument to not the good, but the bad in life, but a monument from which we can learn and say, yes, this did happen. This is one where it did. And because Clotilda is so intact, because a few of us have been inside the very space in which those captives have been held, with the remains of the platforms that they were stacked on naked, in this brutal, dehumanizing voyage in which they kept their humanity and their culture and imparted that to their children and their children's children and beyond. That's ultimately, for me, one of the most profound things about the entire Clotilda project is the people.
I'm hearing that from multiple sides, is the almost spiritual experience that occurred during the work that happened and the result of the findings. and speaking with Altevese Rosario, the VP of the Descendants Association.
Yes.
And she was talking about how meaningful it was and how much she could feel her ancestors around her when all of this was happening. So that's kind of been a universal comment that I've heard and read through the course of the research for this episode.
For us, I think the Descendants have been powerful, and I know a number of them now, and their stories are profound. And what I think is also important and we have to recognize is that there were people back then and even up till recently who said that did not happen, denied it happened. There are still people who say, well, that just can't be Clotilda. No, it is. It's very powerfully so. And what happened, happened. And again, the importance and the power of something like an archaeological site, like the shipwreck itself, to bear witness as in a powerful way that people can say, well, yeah, that's your family's history, that's your family's story, as if those stories weren't passed down, as if those stories weren't remembered. But there it is. And I would say you can't argue with forensic evidence, but people do all the time, even in court.
Jim, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your contributions here. This has been an excellent recording session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anytime, any opportunity to talk about ships that wreck and the people behind them, count me in.
Joining me from Philadelphia, I now have Altevese Rosario. We talk about her experience growing up as a descendant of those who survived the Clotilda. Ms. Altevese is an educator out of Philadelphia, and she is the vice president of the Clotilda Descendants Association. So welcome. My name's Lauren. This is the Naughty Archaeologist podcast because we talk about nautical archaeology on this podcast. And if you don't mind, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, and all that?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Lauren. And side note, I love the wordplay of the title. My name is Altevese Rosario, and I am an educator in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I've lived here for a few decades. I am originally from Mobile, Alabama, and I am the great-great-great-granddaughter of Kosolo Oluwale, whose enslaved name was Cudjoe Lewis.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Keep going.
I'm also the proud vice president of the Clotilda Descendants Association, which is the 2.0 version of the original association, which began with another group of descendants in the 80s, and they were obviously really proud of their history. They were the story keepers of that time, and wanted to not only continue to keep the story alive, but they wanted to also continue to highlight the community and push the story out to a broader audience and ensure that the descendants and that the story and Africa Town received the recognition that it deserves. So I am proud, I'm honored to continue in that legacy.
We're really excited to talk about the story of Africa Town, the descendants of Cudjoe. Tell me a little bit about Cudjoe himself. Who was Cudjoe Lewis?
Yeah, Cudjoe Lewis was a very strong and resilient man. He lived in Banti, Benin. He spoke Icha. He was Yoruba. And he lived a wonderfully documented life in Africa for 19 years before being captured by the Dahomey King Galele, he and his tribe, and before he was enslaved and brought to what is now called Plateau, Alabama.
What are some of the stories that you're, like, an oral history growing up? What are some of the stories that you heard about Cudjoe?
Yeah, so my grandmother, who's actually the little person to my left, your right.
A little post-production note here. In our video interview, Ms. Altevese had a photo of her family that was behind her, which is what she references in this segment.
Mary West Wonders.
Cool.
Cudjoe participated in the raising of her. He was instrumental in raising her. And she was an adolescent when he passed away. So she had firsthand accounts of his life, pre-enslavement, during, and then post-enslavement. So in the same way that she and her siblings and her first cousin would sit at his feet and hear stories of his life, I and my brother sat at her feet in that same way, in that same tradition. And she would tell me the most wonderful stories of him and how, he loved his family. He's very much family oriented, especially having been severed from his family in Benin. So he was very caring and loving. He had great agricultural skills. So, he farmed. Mm-hmm. We had, and I say we because I even lived on the land that he purchased. We had pecan trees and peach trees. There was all this fruit, and he would go and pick fruit and give fruit to them. Especially when they were, just he wanted to celebrate them, or just a nice gesture. She would tell me stories of how we would go to market, and she would tell me stories about how he was disappointed because he was looking forward to becoming an oral and living out the traditions of his tribe and the life that he had envisioned for himself. And he was just always there. He taught them the language of Icha, and he taught them before he became a Christian. He practiced voodoo. That was a common religion. And yeah, and it's funny because my grandmother wouldn't really, and she's probably, my grandmother has been deceased for some time, so she's probably like turning over right now. It's like, Altevese doing she was, a very devoted Christian woman, as am I. But, history is love, and we should share that, right? And so, they learned about the practice of voodoo, even though they didn't practice it as a family, they still learned about it, and they learned of his family and how he cherished his family and how he just always longed to return. And with all of the accomplishments and achievements of his life and his family, and even in the sorrow of him losing his wife, children, the one thing that always pressed against his heart and his spirit was that he wasn't able to return.
I cried when I read Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston. I was like, oh, Cujo. He lost so much, my guy.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about Cujo's life in terms of, because in Barracoon, he talks a lot about his past, and Ms. Hurston goes to great lengths to discuss the hurt and the pain that Cujo had experienced, not only due to being enslaved and working on the plantation, but additionally his family grief that he had to experience.
Yeah. So while that pain, that suffering of loss certainly permeated deep within him, that wasn't something that was pushed through or bred through in our family, right? Like, so our family was filled with love, and we were taught love and joy, and honestly, those experiences taught us how to be resilient, right? Like, if someone can endure that and still smile and still love and still have joy and a sense of peace, at times, of course, not all the time, but who are we to not, right?
Exactly.
And so that was a common thread amongst the generations of our family. I come from a very tough people folk.
Well, I think you can see that in the thread of Africa Town and how the town itself has grown.
Yeah.
Because, Cujo bought that land his damn self.
Yeah, absolutely.
Additionally with the community, but they purchased that. They were not handed anything.
And they worked hard for that, and they sacrificed in ways that many people now will have no idea, because they worked in, foreign land, foreign language. Even the people who looked like them didn't fully accept them. And still in the midst of that, they said, no, if we're not able to return home physically, we're going to create our own home. And we are going to do whatever it is that we need to do to stick together, to maintain community. And they did that. And they did that in a way that has not been duplicated.
It is a truly unique story of its founding, because not only are they survivors of a enslavement smuggling operation, they were trafficked into the U.S. by a bed. And then they had to work until the end of the Civil War. And even further on, their efforts never stopped, right? They were just able to use their own work to create their own space. Absolutely. Rather than working for someone else. How have you seen some of the repercussions from the founding of Africatown echoed in how Africatown has developed into what it is today?
Much of that resilience and tenacity is still there, right? Like, at Africatown's height, during its boom, there were more than 10,000 residents that were there. And it was a truly self-sustained community. They had everything that they needed. And the folks that were there, the descendants, and then, others that came into the community, they knew and they valued the importance of community, of us. This is us, regardless of what's happening around us. We know that within this community, we can not only survive, but we can thrive. And that is what they did. And while the community, unfortunately, has dwindled over generations, like I said, that tenacity is still there, right? Like the folks that are still there, many of my family members that are still there, they have not given up on their community. They are still fighting for their community, and they know that they can thrive yet again.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, definitely. What have you seen in terms of the connection to the Clotilda as that string has gone through its development and its growth?
Yeah. So the connection to the Clotilda, and just as a side note, like myself and a few other descendants, we don't care for the fact that the Clotilda is placed on this pedestal. Right? Like,
sure. Absolutely.
It's about the 110 enslaved Africans that came over on the, it's about the 32 individuals that created that community. Having said that, like the strand is that there's still that push and pull. There's still that hovering and choking of the enslaved folks, their descendants, the community, and the kind of overseer. And that still permeates throughout the community and even in the surrounding communities, because, there's still that hold that's there. There's still that guard that doesn't allow.
The shadow.
Exactly. The shadow. And then there's that it buttresses up against, like there's almost like a fence around it that says, okay, this is where the powers that be are going to allow you to remain and only in this place.
How did the wreck's discovery and publication, because it took national attention, right? Yeah. National Geographic did a Drain the Oceans on it. There's been a 2020 episode.
Yeah.
Like Anderson Cooper got in there. I remember, so I worked for Search for a little while last year. And so I was going through some of the photos in their like backstock, and I start seeing like feet sticking out of the water, and I keep going, and there's this guy in the boat, and I'm like, that guy looks a lot like Anderson Cooper. I had no idea they had done the 2020 episode on it yet. And then I kept going, it's Anderson Cooper, and he's just
Anderson Cooper.
his feet out of the water. It was a real experience. But how did sorry, just derailed. Um, how did the wreck's discovery affect that shroud and that stain that the Clotilda's legacy has kind of imbued?
It brought it to the forefront of the nation and in other parts of the globe. The discovery of the ship, which, side note, was worst kept secret amongst the community.
Right.
Right. Like, everyone there knew where it was. Like, there was literally no secret about it. It was just others catching up to the notes.
Right.
And so, yeah, it shines a light on the community, on the story that would have never happened. It has given it such a broad audience, and people are now paying attention to what's happening and to what's not happening and to what should be happening. People are paying attention to the environmental ills that have plagued the community for decades. People are paying attention to the shrinkage in population, to the food deserts, to, the lack of resources. And people are saying, hey, wait, not only is this a historical community, but these are people. And these are people that deserve better. And these are people who are marginalized in a way and being crushed in a way that should not happen, cannot happen, and won't happen because now we see. And resources are coming in, which is great. And folks are coming alongside of Descendants and Africa Town and other entities that are saying, you know what, we're going to do something about it. Other grassroots organizations, and people are saying, let me come alongside you. Let me partner with you and help fix and help right this wrong.
That's really encouraging to hear. I hadn't seen a lot of the updates that have happened since the 2022 documentary Descendants came out. Okay. And so I saw some of the museum openings, and they're starting to do some commemorative things.
Yes.
I hadn't seen the results of all of that yet. So that's really encouraging to hear. That's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's slow going, but, squeaky wheels get turned.
Right.
And we're making a lot of noise.
Stay squeaky.
Absolutely.
The environmental issues that you mentioned, they have plagued that area since, I believe it was when Mobile decided to give Africa Town running water in the 60s. And that's when the Mears leased out, I think, the land that they had owned kind of in the area. I think it's under Chippewa Holdings now.
Yeah, Chippewa Holdings.
So they had leased out that land to the biggest paper mill in the world. Talk a little bit about that effect on the town, because if I remember correctly, it's pretty significant.
Absolutely, it's hugely significant, and it's funny because it's had a dual effect, right? Like, it gave people jobs, right?
Right.
And then jobs where many people in the community worked in this paper mill, and they were able to build lives and sustain their families off of these jobs, all while having their water, having their soil, having their air polluted on a daily basis. A lot of people in the area grew their own food, had livestock, and they are these toxins are, in the soil, and they're growing their food, and they're now ingesting it, in their food, in the air. My uncle grew up there and actually lived with my great-grandmother, who was Cudjoe's granddaughter, in the home that he built on that land, that home that he lived in and raised his family. And my uncle had battled cancer twice. And we have a lot of family members, a lot of folks in that area who've been diagnosed with cancer and other respiratory diseases. And it's really like, and on one hand, someone may say, oh, well, people aren't eating healthy. They're not doing this. They're not taking care of themselves. But it's like, no. There's a large amount of folks in a concentrated area. We call that a certain thing. And we're not going to deny that has happened. So it's had that dueling effect. And then once, that company came, then other companies and other industries. And now Africatown is really surrounded by heavy industry. And there is constant pollution, and again, fortunately, there are organizations that are fighting back against that. But over time, it's caused great harm to the health and the welfare of the community.
Absolutely. How are some of the movements working to change so that? Has it had an effect? What are some of the results that you've seen from that?
So they are having effects. Again, small but mighty, right? So there have been ordinances and legislations that have forced those industries to revamp how they are doing business. There are no longer any additional industries that can come in. And so there's a lot on that side. And I'm not familiar with all of the environmental work that's on that side, but there's a great organization, MIJAC, that is in chess, and they are doing some really great work around that environmental piece.
Cool. That's really cool to hear. Are there some commemorative spaces for not only the people who were affected by these pollutive industries, but additionally commemorative spaces for the 32 founders of the town and kind of how their legacy has affected everyone? And what do those look like?
As I said, we're the reboot of the original organization, and in that original organization, year after year, served to put on commemorative events that celebrated the founders of the community. Now, with our Clotilda Descendants Association 2.0, we have a Spirit of Our Ancestors festival that's held every year in February. So, we just kind of missed that. And it's held in the community in the Mobile County Training School, which was the school that those 32 brave and brilliant folks created because they knew that they needed to educate their children. So they built their own school. And so in that school, we have our festival where we honor our ancestors. And there is a play that has been, that we've commissioned called An Ocean in My Bones, which tells the story of our ancestors. And then also in July, we commemorate the landing of the 110 in Mobile, and we call that our landing event. Again, that's happening in July. They landed here July 8th. And so this year it's July 5th and 6th. And everyone come on out. It's going to be a huge celebration. And the descendant community, and not just in that area, but the descendant community from across the country. We descend in Mobile, in Plateau, exactly. And we share stories of our ancestry and our current families. And we commune together. We celebrate. We go out to the site to where Clotilda is. We go out to the site of the shipwreck where Clotilda is. And we pay homage to our ancestors. And it's a solemn and uplifting event. Those two things can exist at the same time. And it really does energize our efforts and our strength to continue to go on and not only celebrate our history, but to educate the world on our history.
Generational memory.
Absolutely.
It's always fascinated me. Paul Connerton was an anthropologist who talked about this kind of stuff, and he specifically called it collective memory. And there's a word that he used, milieu de mémoire, and I'm probably butchering that entire thing. I don't speak French. And he talks about that there's places of memory. And just like we celebrate 4th of July, these are the ways that communities and societies remember things. So I've always found that just completely fascinating.
Absolutely.
It's so cool. And to see that people, it's not just like state sanctioned versions of these, like these are community-based memories. These are specific to those individuals that it has specifically affected.
Yeah.
So I just love that. I think that's so cool.
I agree. Absolutely.
So this is obviously an emotionally charged kind of an event. Has anyone ever shown up that is a different descendant, such as a foster or a mirror, people who are descended from the individuals who generations ago were at fault for this?
Absolutely. Actually, a couple of years ago, a group of descendants were able to meet a descendant of Captain Foster, Mike Foster, and who, my uncle is now like very close friends with, which, figure, I know, right? It's like, the puppy and the lion are like, friends. And and there have been, Mike Foster has come and has shared and is just really supportive and has actually, on behalf of his ancestor, apologized. And you see that authentic care and that sincere acknowledgement of this was wrong. And I'm sorry to even be connected to a person that did this thing. And the Mayer family, a branch, I'll say, of the Mayer family, they have been supportive around efforts. They have asked if they could join. And as a matter of fact, they asked last year if they could come and be a part of, and not in any, real way, just, come and just, community landing. And actually, we asked them not to, just because it was, a
lot of tension.
For sure. Tension may be such that it just may not go as well as we would like it to. But like I said, a branch of the Mayer family has extended themselves in a way.
That's really good to hear. From the records that I can find online and from the documentaries and Ben Rain's articles, it's been discouraging to see some of the Mayer's reactions. And so it's a nice change to hear about, that some, not all, have come out and been in support of this. That means that there's generational change that has happened, maybe not to an extent that could indicate anything for, and so, but it is good to know, and especially like seeing the Fosters and the difference between, so that means that there has been shifts in each generation's like thought paradigm on how this has come out, and to see that learning over generations, that's really cool to see.
Agreed. It is, because it's certainly not something that as a descendant community we expected, because as you said, for generations, there's not been a conversation. There's not been an acknowledgement. There's actually been the push to silence and choke out the story. And it is a great turn of events. It is a hopeful indicator of things to come. So, we as a descendant community are excited about moving forward.
Definitely. I know that there's a lot of, it's built on itself, and over with the Mayers specifically.
Right. Layered frustration, layered aggravation.
And there's been intentional insult that has been doled out. There's been intentional racism and movements to withdraw as much power as they can in their history. So I understand that like the Fosters didn't quite have that grip on the community.
Not at all.
Where the Mayers do. The Mayers own a lot of that land still in the area. And so there's more than just words that have been exchanged here. And so it's a lot deeper than surface level of like, well, your ancestor was mean to mine.
Right, absolutely. And I just say, and it's still very much prevalent in your face every single day. We're still here. And not just our presence, but our power.
Street names. And like, I saw them in the documentary. They're the red markers that are painted, and just stuck everywhere. And
it is. And and it's funny because it's mixed emotion around those, name markers. Like some folks are like, get that out of here. Again, it's a daily reminder of atrocity. I don't want to see it anymore. It's difficult for me to move forward while still being able to see that thing every day. Whereas others are like, you know what? No, I want that to be here because I want anyone who comes here to know you're the one. You did this thing. You are a part of you are the main reason why not only are we here, but that our community is in the state that it's in. So it's interesting to see, the two faces of that coin.
And I can understand both perspectives on that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's definitely some complicated emotions going on in there. So I completely understand that.
Yeah.
I understand that you're in Philadelphia now.
Yes. I'm in Philadelphia.
And you're an educator. So tell us about how this background plays into the education and the teaching that you perform and conduct your everyday life with.
Absolutely. So obviously I have a unique background, right? I am in an elite group of African Americans who know, and even more so for my family and a few other families who know exactly where we come from. We can touch the exact point in a country, in a village on the continent of Africa, and name where we are from. We can name our language, we can name our culture, as opposed to, unfortunately, the single narrative that has been crafted in Western society about African Americans and where you come from. In having that knowledge, I have a sense of self that many people do not. And I can hear other narratives that have been generated about me and people who look like me. And I can not only immediately say false, completely false, but I can take that and recognize it for what it is. And that is someone else's view of me that has to be crafted and maintained in order for them to feel a certain kind of way, in order for them to accomplish a certain kind of thing. So in going into education, especially educating little Black and brown children, I come with a sense of power and authority that others may not, right? When I see my kids, I see the brilliance of them. I'm no longer in the classroom. Now I'm serving as, on a leadership coaching realm, but I'm still in schools almost every day. And I see instruction and I coach folks on best practice in instruction. And I get to remind children that they are great, right? In education, little Black and brown children, the month of February are taught their history begins at slavery. It does not. The majority of the month of February starts with slavery and then spans out from slavery. The people that are talked about, great people, but they're talked about their work in defense and offense of people coming out of slavery and building a better life for themselves. And then, we sprinkle in a couple of inventors, George Washington Carver, maybe a Garrett Morgan or Elijah McCoy. And then we tie it up with now Barack Obama and John Lewis, and boom, that's your history. I get to come from a perspective of more than 1,000 years before slavery, you were great. And these are the people that you come from. And because these are the people you come from, the people who invented mathematics, the people who advanced science in ways that are being built upon, that are the foundation of the science that we see every day, because you come from that, you can literally do anything. And my expectation of you is far higher than a lot of other folks. My expectation of the children who I taught was, there are no excuses. I do not care what your background is. I do not care what your family dynamic is. I do not care where you live. This is what you can do. And I am going to be the one to push you in ways that are going to make you uncomfortable, that are going to make you sad, but are going to get you to the point of accomplishment, of you really living to your greatest capacity. And so that's a unique lens that I can educate people from. And I can educate educators from that lens who grew up knowing history, American history. And again, beginning at slavery, and maybe you don't have these natural ties to your origin story. And so you have a skewed view of how you should even teach children, because you have a skewed view of yourself. And
built upon itself.
Exactly. It's those layers, right? Exactly. And so now I get to coach educators and say, no, no, this is our greatness. No, 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 this is our standard and we shall rise to it. And you can, and I'm going to help you do it. And this is how, and this is why. So I've always appreciated that lens of self.
Definitely. It breaks that box that everyone has put Black people in and has put African Americans and people of color into as, like, again, where it starts is slavery, because that's where the American story has roots in.
Exactly.
Despite the fact that colonization actually is really kind of where it sits, and there's a lot of background that doesn't get covered in schools.
Yeah. Yeah. And colonizers
got a lot of work to do.
Already people in existence, right? So yeah. But that's another episode.
Thank you so much for talking to me about this. This is so inspiring, and so, like, the story of the Clotilda isn't a story about the Clotilda at all. It is a story about Africa Town Plateau, the 32 people and the 110 before them that started that community movement and survived togetger in those holds. And it's never been about the ship, ever. And as just,
oh my goodness, yes.
Archaeology is all about storytelling. It's all about the story of what it meant, right? We want to know about, it's never been about the ship itself. It's always about sailors' lives and the shipment and the trade that was going on at the time, and what that means for the communities that surrounds them. Archaeology is a branch of anthropology. And anthropology wants to know about the people and the souls and the humans.
Exactly. And you know what? It's so, on one hand, it's so very odd to me that everything's just connected to the ship. And then on the other hand, it's like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense, because again, let's consider who's sharing the narrative. Because when we think about, the Mayflower and the folks that came over on the Mayflower, we do not say descendants of the Mayflower. Like we don't associate their work, their experience with the vessel that brought them here. We look directly at their lives and their lived experiences. And that's something that does, ironically, the Clotilda Descendants Association. And that's what we're doing, especially considering the members of our organization, the Descendants. I mean, if we think about it, there are more than 60 that had nothing to do with Africa Town, but their stories and their lives are just as significant. And we don't want to lose that in just focusing on something that, honestly, Altevese's opinion is irrelevant, which is the shit. It's irrelevant.
It's just a piece of wood.
It is, it is. And so, our goal as an organization is to keep the focus where it should be, which is on the people, on the 110. And then also, of course, on Africa Town, on this branch, because that community is significant, but we don't ever want to leave out. We don't ever want to make those other 60-some enslaved Africans who have the same exact voyage that those that built Africa Town have. We don't want to make them or their descendants feel as though they're not a part of the story. This is their story. This is our story.
Absolutely. And I mean, the kind of CSI levels of identification of the ship, I find that process to be really interesting. But that's a process. It's not necessarily putting all of that on the ship and the name that comes with it. Because like you said, that name has become a shroud. Yes. And so I've been reading Dr. Delgado's book on the Clotilda and the archaeological kind of write-up that's been going on with it. It's interesting to me that it was a punishable offense by law. Yeah. I think eventually the Mears and the Fosters were fined. The penalty was hanging.
Yeah, the penalty was hanging, absolutely. And so there was no proof that they smuggled people, just cargo, and how they did that and yada yada. That was illegal, and so they were fined. And interestingly enough, never paid the fine. So there was nothing. There was nothing.
Oh, surprise.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, I'm glad to see that the descendants of the Fosters have made some progress.
Yes, I will say, I've met Mike Foster, and great guy. And can I honestly say that he was surprised and appreciative of how the Descendants embraced him, because, you don't know, right? Like,
Right.
Lester did this.
Scary thing to be walking into.
For sure. You're walking into, a crowd of Descendants, and it's like, holy crap, how are they going to receive me? Am I going to be cussed out? Am I going to punch in the face? Like, am I going to be ignored? Like, or any combination of those things.
Yeah.
But everyone was literally, and I remember, like, my cousin Cassandra, she asked me if she could hug him. And she did, I know. And everyone was just like, you know what? Just first of all, thank you for even coming and wanting to meet with us. And then,
Right.
and in his heartfelt acknowledgement and an apology on behalf of his ancestor. Just a great guy, like I said. And he and my Uncle Gary, they're like best buddies. They talk on the phone often. And
I love that.
absolutely, exactly. It's really cool.
And to see that healing in a generational sense, like,
Exactly. And it's healing on both sides, right?
yeah.
And we need that healing. We as people need that acknowledgement, need that value, need that understanding, so that we can heal and then move forward. It's
Right.
this country tells African Americans slavery happened 400 years ago. Why are we still talking about it? Yada yada. Why is there still this thing? And you can't harm a person, not acknowledge it, not even identify if they are healing, or you see that they're not, and then say, get over it. If I come right now and I hit you with my car, right? I hit you with you're walking down the street, living your best life. I hit you with my car. I go over to the side. I see you. And, and you're struggling to get up. Maybe someone's helping you. Your arm is going this way. Your leg is going this way. And I hit you and I say, well, my God, I hit you an hour ago. Why are you still laying there? This happened 2 weeks ago. This happened a month ago. All right, you got to live, but all right, whatever. Like, you're fine. Move it along. No, people are not fine. People are not okay. While on one hand, I understand the fear of some folks acknowledging it, but because, you're afraid of what's going to then come from that acknowledgement.
Right.
But at the same time, when you harm a person, you attempt to at least check and see if they're okay. The humanity in you, the decency in you should prompt you to say, wow, let me help you. Wow, I recognize that I did this thing, or that my car did this thing to you. And this is real for you, and that you cannot just skip along as though this didn't happen. And it's really, and we do ourselves a disservice in this country by pretending as though people can move forward. People can't move forward after they've been harmed. It's not a thing.
Well, and when you're the instigator, you don't get to tell someone, I didn't hurt you.
Exactly. Or you
when
should,
they're clearly hurt.
When they're clearly hurt. Exactly. Or you should be fine. And an acceptable period of time has passed, and you should be fine. You don't get to make that determination. You don't.
And I think that there's a lot of work that we got to do to come to terms with, like, one, we can't keep not talking about it.
Right. Like, the other way is this, we're not going to pretend as though it didn't happen. That's not a thing.
Right. Critical race theory is taking that history, putting it in a structural perspective that you can see how things were shaped. Yes. And how things are still in existence that are designed specifically to exclude.
Right. And how that impacts individuals' daily lives, how that impacts how people are able to move forward in society, how they're even able to hold themselves up by their bootstraps and, and do the thing. Because I'm all for that. Right. But when there are all of these measures and layers that are getting in the way, how do you pull yourself up out of the bootstraps when you don't even have boots? What is that?
Exactly. And like just like we deconstruct abuse in our therapy, how we work with our psychiatrists, we have to do that with history. But I think people who study history aren't doomed to repeat it. They're doomed to actually just scream at everyone else from the sidelines.
Yep. It's draining and it's disappointing.
Do you know what happened to the other 60 that were a part of?
So we don't know what happened with all of them, 60 plus. We have a great partnership with a lot of historians that are doing that work around, for sure, around the migration of those, because those folks were unfortunately scattered throughout Mobile, throughout the state, rather, not even let me say Mobile, scattered throughout the state and neighboring states. So we have, fortunately, through the elevation of this story and the attention of this story, we have had other descendants whose ancestors are outside of the African founders that have come and said, hey, I'm a descendant of Aretha Riggins. Hey, I'm a descendant of Matilda McCreer. Hey, I'm a descendant of this person. And we're like, yes, yay, come join us. Come alongside of us. Yay. So there have been several other ancestors outside of the founders of Africatown that have been identified, and their descendants are coming forward. But unfortunately, there are dozens that are still unknown because, again, they were scattered.
I think it wasn't until 1870 census that Black folks weren't allowed to even, that they were allowed to use a surname in the census.
Exactly.
So it's gonna be hard to track people down for sure.
It is. But, fortunately for many of the descendants, their ancestors share their story in the same way that Cudjoe shared his story, right? And those descendants have documentation of their history, and they can say, no, here I am. Here's my proof. Here is my great-great-grandmother's story. Here's my grandmother's this. Here's my great-great-great-grandfather's that. And they can trace their lineage. So there's a lot of work that still needs to happen. And we welcome everyone to come alongside of us to partner so that we can do this work, because my God, we would love to find descendants of all of those enslaved folk that were trafficked here on the, so that we would absolutely love to do that. And, we're willing to put in the work to help others identify their lineage. I want as many folks to join our collective as possible.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent plan. How can they find you if they're listening right now?
Okay, so if you are listening, then please go to theclotildastory.com, and that is the webpage of the Descendants of Clotilda. Me personally, and it's a shame because I am not social media savvy, so you'll hear other people say, oh, you find one here, find one here. I am on Instagram, Altevese Rosario, and you can email me, bp@theclotildastory.com. Please, we would love all of the help, all of the people, right? Come and help us do this work, because it's a lot of work. It's joyful work. It's defining work. And we love it. And we know that there are a lot of folks who are not descendants of the 110 who are like, yeah, I want to help you. I want to partner alongside of you, And here's the reality of our story. Beyond fortunate to God that I can, again, trace my lineage. Our story, really, and the story of the 110 is the story of every African American in this country, right? Like we happen to be blessed to know our. It is the same. Africans were kidnapped and trafficked to this country, and they were enslaved. And that continued for hundreds of years. And I've had so many people come to me and say, you have inspired me to research my heritage. And they feel connected to us and to our story and to me. And that's so empowering. And that's what we want. We want to empower the masses, and not just descendants of slaves, but descendants of colonizers. Listen, because it really does take all of us to make this thing better, to make this thing called life work, to make this thing called society run in a way that it should, and for everyone to have what they need in order to thrive. So please come and check us out.
I will make sure and put everything in the show notes as well. So you can click the links in our show notes and head over to the ClotildaStory.com. Thank you so much, Miss Altevese, for talking to me. And it's been a pleasure. I look forward to being able to put this out and have people listen to it. And this has been excellent. Thank you so much.
This is exciting. Thank you so much. I appreciate you, Lauren. I appreciate you giving me the forum to share. If you don't have anything to do the first weekend of July, come on down to Mobile for our landing event. Absolutely. Yeah. It's going to be great.
I will do my best. Thank you so much. All right, nerds. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening to the stories. And thank you for understanding that sometimes podcasts go a little long, and that's okay. You can pause it and come back to it. That's the beauty of a podcast. A very special thank you to Dr. James Delgado and to Miss Altevese Rosario. I look forward to hearing everybody's thoughts and feedback. You can find all of our sources in the show notes. You can find us on social media. Our Instagram and X handles are at Naughty Podcast. Remember, that's NAUTI podcast. Instagram and X. On TikTok, you can find us at Naughty Pod. On YouTube, you can follow the podcast and listen to it through there. I don't do visual or video on YouTube. It's just audio with like a still image. If I were to do a video on YouTube, with the way that I cut my audio and like clean up the time frames and the dead air and the space gaps and clean out the ums and the likes and the you-knows and everything like that, you would hate me with how it clips and clips and clips and clips and clips on a video. So we're just audio only at this point. But you can follow us on YouTube. Our channel is at Naughty Pod. You can, like, subscribe, fave, whatever people do these days. Listen how you want. We are also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher, Overcast, iHeartRadio. And that's it. That's our socials. I'll post socials for our guests in the show notes as well. Thank you for listening. Go get wet, nerds.
Discord.